Hey everyone, today we're going to explore one of history's oldest altered images, or oldest deepfakes, the Lincoln-Calhoun Composite. Now before we do start, I do want to say that all citations for sources are in the description, along with a link to the original script of the video, which obviously I'm reading off right now. Do what you want with all that information. Anyway, let's get into the Lincoln-Calhoun Composite. That image is an alteration. That's not the original. It's an alteration, actually, of an engraving done by A.H. Ritchie in 1852. Oh, and this is the image. So for those who don't know, probably most do, that's John C. Calhoun. He's standing upright in a suit with the United States flag and globe to his right. And then to his left of the image, there is... No, his left, our right of the image. There's a table with some books and pages. And those pages, it's hard to see in this image. I have a better one for later. They have the following words: the sovereignty of the states, free trade, and strict constitution. Those words will be brought back up. They place some importance into kind of what I speculate later on. And obviously there is a second original image, since the altered version takes Lincoln's face from the 1864 photograph of Lincoln. That photograph was taken by Anthony Berger at the Matthew Brady studio. That information comes from the Manhattan Rare Book Company. Obviously, this is the photo. It depicts just Lincoln. He's sitting down. He's relaxing. He's there for a photo shoot. He's relaxing. The Lincoln-Calhoun Composite was created sometime in the mid to late 1860s, most say kind of 1865, and it was created by William Pate. I'm going to say Pate. There isn't an exact known reason why this image was altered, although through my research, I have discovered some possible reasons like profit, change in views, making Lincoln look like more of a hero, and there are some other reasons. I'm going to go into more detail about the image in a second, but I do imagine that some of you who don't know who I am, just stumbled upon this, thought it was an interesting topic, want to know why I'm talking about this. Well, I found the image interesting. It feels like something that most of us have probably seen before in a history book or a textbook, and never knew it was an altered image, which makes it even more unique to me. As a kid, I was very fascinated with Abraham Lincoln, especially the American Civil War. I wrote several papers about Lincoln and his background, along with doing some statistical research about the Civil War. Given several presentations about those things. As well as that, I have pretty garbage experience with photo editing, but I understand the basics. I know how to do it. So, I feel like I have some ability to talk on these subjects. Now, obviously today, we have deepfake technology is super easy. It's not like the 1860s where they had to superimpose and all that, and it was super hard to do. Now it's like, all right, I don't need any experience. You can even talk to AI and have it make things for you. But I imagine, some questions about, why was it altered? What were all the changes? Who do they even want to see the image? And some more, possibly. And that's what I plan to answer today. Obviously, we need to start with the alterations for anything to be relevant at all about this image. Looking at both images side by side, there are some blatant alterations, such as Lincoln's head on Calhoun's body, which, again, Pate's superimposed that. Superimposing is just layering an image over the other. So he basically just had Lincoln's head layered over Calhoun's body. He did make a mistake, though, and if you look at the original image of Lincoln, his head is flipped in the Lincoln-Calhoun Composite. I don't think that has a meaning to it. I think that was just a mistake. And there's not much else changed. The heads are changed, and that's, the most blatant one. There's no alterations to much of the background or the coloring or background items, except for the words on the books. as you can see, the original, has the words I mentioned earlier: sovereignty of the states, free trade, strict constitution. On the new one, we now have proclamation of freedom, union, and constitution. Why were these changed? I'll get into that in a moment. And both changes, I believe, were made so the Lincoln-Calhoun Composite would better align with what Lincoln believed in. And when I first viewed this image, I initially just saw the face swap, right? It's the most blatant, it's easy to see. And since I only knew that John C. Calhoun was a Southerner, I thought it was just goofy, poking fun at the South for losing the Civil War. And doing some research and looking at stuff, I learned that the books had their words changed. And that's thanks to an article posted to the BBC. That was written by Fiona MacDonald. She's a senior journalist for the BBC. She studied at the University of London. And she actually was the only reason I really did notice that, because in the original image it was hard to tell. But she pointed out, and luckily they had a better version of the photo. And I believe that those words were changed to better align with Lincoln's beliefs, especially since the image did come out after Lincoln's assassination. So, Civil War was ending, slavery was ending. Firstly, when talking about the era, I think we need to talk about John C. Calhoun. Again, I don't think many people know who he is. I didn't. In basics, Calhoun was a Southern politician and political philosopher. Jeez. According to an article on JSTOR, The Public Choice Theory of John C. Calhoun, written by Alexander Tabarrok and Tyler Cohen. They go into some of Calhoun's writings. Quote, Calhoun writes that there never was such a state of nature, and never can be. Man's natural state is the social and political, the one for which his Creator made him, and the only one in which he can preserve and perfect his race. End quote. Basically, this is one of Calhoun's writings where he kind of implies whites got to preserve their race, no mixing with blacks. We need to perfect our own race, and it's not going to be perfected with anyone else except for white people. Following the quote, they would write, quotes, the ultimate good, and he refers to the end for which society is ordained by God. His statement about the good of the community and for the human race provide little of substance. This lack of ethical foundation shows up in Calhoun's defense of slavery. End quote. Sorry. I ended the quote too soon. Calhoun was all for slavery. He was actually a big component in fighting to keep it around. And he actually believed, in their article, they also mentioned that he basically knew that the North was coming after slavery, and he was like, pretty sure there's going to be a civil war, guys. Good luck, y'all. He did die before the Civil War started, but he basically was one of the first Southerners to say that slavery shouldn't end, and that it was good. I understand that Calhoun knew that the South wouldn't let slavery end. This article really showed just how much slavery was embedded in the South, especially for Calhoun, and how much he believed in it. I had no idea he was considered at the time a political philosopher, especially with what he was fighting for, but, philosophers are, they're not always the best of people. And if you, for whatever reason, don't understand who Abe Lincoln is, I don't know how you found this video in the first place, but I'll give just a brief, real simple overview. He was the 16th President of the United States. He was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. Abraham Lincoln was, I believe it was at Ford Theater. He was shot in the back of the head by Booth. And Booth, it was funny how Booth got away. He jumped. So Lincoln was in one of the cool little press boxes, whatever you want to call it. And Calhoun shot him and then jumped off of it. I believe Booth broke one of his legs and like gimped away before being caught. Lincoln did survive the night, but he would die the following morning, which is obviously, I mean, that's the first presidential assassination in U.S. history. Then, of course, the composite is speculated to have been crafted sometime in 1865, obviously following Abe Lincoln's assassination, the end of slavery, the end of the Civil War. Again, coming from McDonald. And Mississippi State credits William Pate as the one who made the alterations and published the work. And then from Vintage Everyday, they write in an article, they write quotes, "Some believe this print was made because there were not enough heroic-style portraits of Lincoln made during his life," end quote. MacDonald also seems to agree with that sentiment. I'm not exactly sure what makes Calhoun's original image so heroic, but apparently those at the time saw it as heroic, saw it as more presidential, which I guess I can see that. But, coming after Lincoln's assassination, they couldn't exactly, grab his body and post him up and just be like, yep, this looks good, take a photo. So they used someone else's body. I had never thought, though, about how some images of Lincoln came to be. I figured they were taken during his life. But instead, now I know that some of them weren't. Some of them are alterations. That messes with me a little bit because I love Lincoln. Makes you wonder about our history a little bit. So yeah, these sources really do. I mean, the Mississippi State University showing that it was truly altered. McDonald and Vintage Everyday also writing decent articles about the alterations. I mean, yeah, crazy to think about something like that from the 1860s. Moving on, on top of Lincoln's death, there's also the end of slavery. Now, slavery was a big part of what Calhoun believed in. It goes directly against what Lincoln stood for, though, as he fought to free and end slavery. The end of slavery was a substantial hit to the economy of the South. So according to Greg Timmons, he was a history teacher, has a master's in history. He has published several articles on history.com. And in his article, How Slavery Became the Economic Engine of the South, he writes, and this is not direct, this is paraphrased, he basically writes about how the South began to grow a lot of cash crops, things like rice, tobacco, sugarcane. With these crops came a need for laborers, and to save cost, Southerners used slaves. And then, as they brought more and more slaves over, they got this great idea, hey, we should start breeding them. So they started doing slave auctioning, which, I mean, is crazy to think about now, but back then, I don't even know, man. I don't even know. Again, all this comes from Greg Timmons' article on history. And obviously, with all that said, the slaves were a little important to the South. How it operated, I mean, their economy was built on slaves, basically. And the Emancipation Proclamation, among other effects, ended slavery, which crippled the economy. I mean, a lot of stuff ended there. Cheap labor was gone, your slave auctions were done, and most Southerners were fans of slavery, especially John C. Calhoun and those he surrounded himself by. Timmons really opened my eyes to the fact that the South was driven by slavery. I knew it had some factors, but I didn't realize just how embedded it was. I didn't think about it as an economic factor. For the South, that never crossed my mind. But, I mean, it was huge. It was way too big. And in an article then found on the Library of Congress, which is titled Keith E. Whittington, John C. Calhoun, Constitutionalism and Slavery. This was written by Keith E. Whittington and some others. Keith is a political scientist and a legal scholar, and he writes about John C. Calhoun's strong beliefs in slavery and constitutionalism. A direct quote from his article, quotes, Calhoun is ultimately known for two contributions to political thinking. The second is his full-throated defense of racial slavery as not merely a necessary evil, as an earlier generation of Southern politicians thought it to be, but as a positive good, as his own generation of Southern politicians increasingly asserted. John C. Calhoun, unlike earlier Southerners, thoroughly stood that slavery is not evil, dude. That's a good thing. Think about it. It gives Africans, gives them a job. It's a good thing. That was completely what he thought. He thought, yeah, it gives Africans a job. It saves us cost. And the slave trade, totally fine. Obviously now, hindsight's 2020. We know it's not good. But he and others thoroughly thought, yeah, it's a good thing. Yeah. And for so many young Southerners to begin to believe in such a rhetoric kind of makes it hard to stop, which explains why the war started. I mean, again, this just goes to show more of who Calhoun was. I mean, I didn't realize just how much Southerners fought for slavery, and I had heard that they thought of it as a necessary evil, but to find out some of them were beginning to see it as just a straight positive good is just disgusting. And we've also got the end of the Civil War. If you do not know about the American Civil War, I'll give you a brief rundown, mostly of why it started, because I think that's important to the image. So in the article Myths and Misunderstandings, What Caused the Civil War, which is by John Koski. John Koski is an American Civil War historian. He explains basically that the southern states wanted to secede from the Union. They saw this as a constitutional right, and the federal government basically said, no. This caused the South to be a little angry. So what did they do? They invaded, or as they called it, seized federal property that was within southern state boundaries. Then around August 12th, 1861, Lincoln sentenced soldiers to try to stop this insurrection, and the American Civil War started. It's also believed that the war started due to the South's reliance on slavery, which it did. However, some Southerners following the end of the war would try to say, no, slavery, no. We didn't try to start that war because we wanted to keep slavery. No. Obviously, a lot of people disagree. I hadn't even really thought that. I mean, this article shows me just that the Southerners were trying to save face by trying to say that slavery had no role in it, even though it did. I also didn't realize, I knew that they had seized some land, but I didn't realize that it was so bad that Lincoln was like, yeah, I did. I thought the war just started because they tried to seize the property, and there were soldiers there already, and they were like, no, this is our compound, and that's how it started, but no. Lincoln sent in people, as he should. Obviously, after about 4 years, the war came to an end. Many Southerners felt defeated. They were watching a lot of what they had known crumble around them. Meanwhile, the North was like, woo! Now, the purpose. When I first viewed this image, I thought it had been altered simply to poke fun at the South for losing the war. And I felt before doing research that face transplant images were not so common, that this was the first of its kind. I mean, it was to make the South feel weaker. They took Lincoln's head, mused Calhoun's body, and since Calhoun was a dominant leader for the South and was seen as powerful, this probably made the South feel the loss even more. Some salt in the wound. And as I did more research, slowly came to learn it was probably because they wanted to make Abe Lincoln look stronger, and because altering images was becoming more commonplace. The image was altered by William Pate. If you're like me, then you probably are wondering who William Pate is. Well, that's hard to say, as not much is known about him. He doesn't have any known biographies or articles published that really talk about him. I had asked Copilot, Microsoft's AI system, about him, and even that couldn't really find much. All it could find was that he was an engraver and publisher, and that his most famous work was the Lincoln-Calhoun Composite. So why was the image created? That's a bit hard to say since we don't know much about the creator. I mean, it makes it more difficult. However, I can speculate the image was created to push the new beliefs of the North and, put some salt in the wound. Also, profit, which I'll come back to a little bit here. Image manipulation and altering was becoming more dominant and was seen in a lot of images with a simple face transplant. In the article, Immortal Image, Harold Holzer reflects on representations of Lincoln, which was an interview conducted by Bonnie Bates. She talks with Harold Holzer, a Civil War culture and Abraham Lincoln scholar. And he states the practice grew exponentially during the Civil War. Prints of old Mexican War-era heroes were reissued with new heads. Beardless pictures of men like Lincoln, Lee, and Jackson were updated. One publisher in Ohio issued about 50 portraits of Union military leaders utilizing only 5 or 6 bodies, on which were grafted interchangeable portraits to meet regional sales demands. End quote. Holzer demonstrates that these altered images were a growing practice. The Lincoln-Calhoun Composite was just another link in the long chain of those from the time. Face transplant alterations weren't super hard to find at the time. They had high demand by the public. Many wanted to be able to hang an image of those they saw as heroes for what they brought about with the American Civil War. Others might have just wanted to throw darts at people they saw as enemies for what happened. Either way, there's a lot of reasons for these alterations. One of them was profit. As well, people wanted more pictures of Lincoln following his death. Again, in that same interview, Bonnie Bates asks, how do representations of Lincoln change from election to assassination? In response, Holzer states, quote, once he was martyred, there was an explosion for demand for pictures, heroic portraits, deathbed scenes, even retrospective pictures that suggested he was an active military leader. End quote. There was a sudden big boom in demand for pictures of Lincoln all over the country, and most wanted to make him look like a military leader. As I said earlier, this was becoming more common, and it's because people wanted their heroes. They wanted an image of their heroes. They didn't care if they weren't really war heroes or anything. And this just shows at the time, portraits were pretty cool. If you could get one of a hero in a cool portrait, it was pretty cool. The other main reason I believe the image was altered was to help shift, into the more northern beliefs and the end of slavery. Obviously, this can be seen with the word changes. The alteration better aligns with Lincoln. One of the main reasons the war was started was simply because the South believed it was within their rights, according to the Constitution, to leave the U.S. and become the Confederate States of America. That's why strict Constitution is in the original engraving. If I had to guess, I think free trade was to do with the slave trade and how the South was firm on continuing it. And lastly, the sovereignty of the states would have probably also been in connection with the strict constitutional line. Where they believe we have all these cool things, but we also have this right to be sovereign states and not end slavery here because we don't want to. So yeah, that's what I speculate the word changes were part of. Because obviously it goes from those words to then ones that better align with Lincoln. Altering images in any respect can change many people's views on an issue or person. As seen easily here and with the other images it was done to in the Civil War era. People made to look like soldiers and generals who fought right on the front lines. To some this would have been stolen valor, to others it would be simply making a heroic photo. However you want to see it. I believe that an image shouldn't be altered to make someone heroic if they weren't. It's not to say Lincoln wasn't heroic. To many, like me, he was. But there are people who shouldn't be praised. People like John C. Calhoun, who was a racist and vehemently believed in slavery. I think the alteration's a good one. But we should not hide who Calhoun was. Our history may be bad, may be muddy, but that doesn't mean it needs to be changed. Only that we should change and learn from what we wish they would have known as we do now. The Lincoln-Calhoun Composite is a great example of altering an image. It gives insights into the time that the people were living in, a time of major changes and sacrifice, the first presidential assassination in this nation's history. The people were living through tragedy and prosperity, just depending on if you were in the North or the South. My research, it truly changed how I view the era. Never cared to look at the South. I never thought to think about how they suffered after this economically. And there's a lot. There's a lot of changes for everybody. I see now that this image wasn't anything special either for the time. It was just another image that the people looked to so they could remember a great president. The image shows the changes that the nation wanted, going from a slave owner to one who didn't own a slave, a politician to a president. Honestly, I was surprised to hear claims that the South denied slavery as a reason for seceding from the United States, given its role. Which again, that's from Koski. His publication really showed that off to me, and Harold Holzer really showed off and allowed me to realize that image manipulation was common practice back then. I believe that in current times, altered images are used far too often. We are getting to a point where we have to background check images before we can even check the story associated with them, because the story, if the image is fake, the story might be fake too. While in these times it was known that most of these images were manipulated by some, they may not have known. We now see that alterations are being hidden. I truly think that there should be some sort of disclaimer or some way to tell when an image is faked. Deepfake technology is now being used by anyone simply because it isn't hard. And in most cases, it does a good job. Look at this cute picture that Copilot made for me. So most people think they may as well do it to push an agenda, to change something. But I feel like this just muddies the line between truth and lies. And in the upcoming years, we could see images that are being inseparable from fake to the real one. And, making, again, images like the one I displayed hard to tell apart. I truly believe that we need to regulate these images. We need to have some sort of way to tell. Because otherwise, I could simply make an agenda I can simply make an image to fit my agenda or to hide history. That's all for today. Have a good day.